Hey guys, so this is our first highlight video for the semester. I'm going to talk a little bit about some concepts from chapter 1 today. And the point of these highlight videos is just for me to give you guys a little bit more information on some of the key concepts from the chapter. So, first up, within chapter 1, you should have read about the concept of actually defining special education. So there's a couple of terms I want to go over with you. So the text talks about an accommodation versus a modification. Now, if you are learning, studying to be a teacher or a counselor, you're going to see these words a lot, particularly when we talk about kids with disabilities. So the terms can be confused pretty easily, so I want to make sure you understand the difference. So, a student who has an accommodation, it's simply a change made to either the way materials are delivered, so the instructional techniques that take place in the room, or the actual materials themselves that do not change the curriculum expectations for that student. Okay, so a change is made, but what the student is ultimately expected to be able to learn or perform in regards to the curriculum stays the same. So an example of this might be a student who has, let's say they have a physical disability, let's say they have cerebral palsy, and they aren't able to write because of this disability. So an accommodation for this student may be that they use a word processing program like Dragon, where they actually dictate to a computer to write a paper for the language arts class. Okay? So the curriculum standard of the writing portion of being able to come up with the words that go on the paper is the same for that student who just happens to be using a computer dictation program versus a student who is actually physically typing their paper on a computer. Now, modification is a more significant change. So when something is modified, a change is made again to the instruction of the materials, but this time the student is no longer meeting the standards of the general ed curriculum. So another example, let's stick with writing since that was our accommodation example. An example of a writing modification might be maybe we have a student who has an intellectual disability and they're expected to construct sentences within their classroom. So this student might be using pre-made word strips to make the sentence. So the spelling is already there, the grammar, the punctuation is all there. The student simply has to put 3 word strips in order to make a sentence. Okay, that student is constructing a sentence, yes, but it's very different from a student who is sitting at their desk with a pen and paper and they are actually having to construct a sentence completely on their own. Okay, so those are kind of the differences between those two terms. Now, another thing I want to point out is students in special education are not the same. Sometimes I think there's a kind of a preconceived notion that a student who's in special education is in special education because they academically can't perform at the same cognitive level as their peers. So they have a lower IQ or they are not as smart as their peers. If you read in chapter 1, you'll notice that the text talks about students who have cognitive differences. Okay, so maybe students who have a lower IQ, okay, or maybe a student who has a deficit in one area. So maybe they underperform in reading. They might overperform or perform on target in math, but reading is an area of struggle for them. We also have students with behavioral differences. So uh, cognitively, these students may be average or above average. However, they have a behavioral disorder that causes them difficulty in the classroom. Communication differences is another area. Um, Students who either have a processing problem, so maybe they struggle with their receptive language. You might have students who struggle expressively with their language. Right? And then you have students who have sensory and physical differences. So going back to my example earlier about a writing accommodation, a student who has a physical disability, they may have average to above average intelligence, yet physically they're limited by their disability. Okay? And so that student would qualify for special education. So now you might be a little bit confused. So what exactly is considered a disability within the schools? So this is actually determined on a state by state level, and we are going to go in depth throughout the semester in regards to what qualifies a student for a learning disability or what qualifies a student for a physical disability and to be within special education for those. But if you take a look at table 1.1 on page 6 in your book, the disability categories under IDEA are listed. And so that can kind of give you a little bit better idea of what kind of disabilities students might have and receive special education services within schools. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit briefly about the history of special education. So I always find this fascinating when I think back on this history because a lot of the history of special education has been within the last 50 years. So if you take a look at your text, um, obviously students with disabilities have been around for a very long time. However, within mid-century of the 1900s, so 1940s and 1950s, the public's perception of students with disabilities really started to change. You have the World Wars that happened during this time period, and we, for the first time, have men who are coming back from these wars with disabilities. Previously, these men were well-respected members of their societies. Now they're coming back disabled, and the public's perception finally begins to see disability in a new light. So this was really monumental in the way that we look at individuals' disabilities, was the veterans coming back from the World Wars. In the 1960s, there was a lot of segregation of students with disabilities within our education system. So often students with even more milder disabilities were educated completely in separate classrooms. In some areas, school wasn't provided for all students, and parents were essentially told to put students in private schools or to institutionalize. So if a student had a more significant disability, so our kids who were in the moderate, severe, profound range of intellectual functioning were institutionalized basically from birth in a lot of areas. And this was something that was advised by the medical profession, not simply the education system. So these students were not educated in any way, which is really sad to think about. So within the 1970s rolls around, this principle of normalization comes about. And essentially what the principle of normalization is this concept that everything should be equal. And so students with disabilities should be provided an equal education, and it should be within the environment and community that they function. So students with disabilities should live, work, and play in the same neighborhood as their neighbor who is typically developing. The principle of normalization was huge during this time period and kind of sparked a lot of the changes that we saw afterwards, immediately afterwards within the educational system. Within 1972, there were two key court cases that were won, and we'll talk more in depth about those next week. But essentially, those two court cases are what sparked the equal rights within schools. So now schools were actually required to provide education for all students, and we say FAPE is the acronym, so it stands for a free, appropriate public education for these students, and that is defined very clearly, and schools were no longer allowed to simply segregate students based on their disability. Out of those key court cases comes our first seminal law that started these things, started FAPE, and that law was called Public Law 94-142. Some people call it PL 94-142. Was also referred to as the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, and that is the law that has changed over the years to become IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Again, we will talk further about that law and all the amendments that have taken place over the years next week. So another important concept that I want to touch on this week is this concept of least restrictive environment. If you are within the schools, you've probably heard of least restrictive environment. And basically this means that students with disabilities should be educated in the environment that is least restrictive to them, in which they can also grow and learn academically. So if you're looking at this chart, the top is considered what is least restrictive, correct? So the general classroom is considered the least restrictive, most typical environment for a student to be educated in. And as you move down the list, we become more restrictive. So I'm just going to talk with you about what each of these means. So a resource room is typically an environment in which students may be educated Some within the general classroom, they may be pulled out for a period or two, or sometimes more, to a smaller room, typically with other students who have disabilities, and they're educated within that classroom with a special education teacher. So students might be pulled out for targeted reading instruction or targeted math instruction, and they can spend some portion of their day in the resource room, or all of the day in the resource room, depending upon what they need. Now, when we move to a separate class, this is what we also call within Georgia sometimes self-contained rooms or self-contained settings. So this is when a student is actually in a completely different classroom. They have a teacher who is not a general education teacher. They are a special education teacher, and they receive some portion of their education within that room. So if you've worked in schools, you might know these rooms we're talking about. I taught in a separate class when I was a classroom teacher. My students stayed with me for the majority of the day, and I delivered all their instruction. Okay, so if you're thinking general versus separate class, you can see that's a lot more restrictive. So within the general classroom, you're having exposure to other peers. With my students in my separate class, they were pretty much exposed to me throughout the day. Now, obviously, they had classmates, but as far as being out with all their other same age, typically developing peers, they didn't get that when they were in my room because it was a completely separate class. Then we moved down to a separate school. I don't know if you follow some educational news, but currently there is a big news article, kind of a stink within Georgia regarding our GNETS program. And GNETS are separate schools all throughout the state that serve students with significant behavioral disorders. So these students are not within their home school. So let's say you're zoned for Tucker Middle School, okay? Well, if you have a separate school as your educational environment, you're not going to go to Tucker Middle School. You're going to be sent to another school that is further away from your home with other students who have similar behavioral disorders. And the GNETS program is under some examination of whether or not those kids are receiving appropriate education within those environments. So if you're interested, you could look that up on the news and read all about that. It's not a good thing for our state, obviously. If students are served in separate schools, we certainly need to make sure that they're receiving the education they deserve and it is an appropriate environment for them to be educated in. After we move from separate schools, we're looking at residential programs. So these are programs where students actually live and are educated there. These are for students who have much more significant disabilities. There are some throughout the state of Georgia. Most residential programs that I've visited have been for students with behavioral disorders. So these are students who have significant behavioral problems. Typically in residential programs, students are not only receiving educational services, but counseling and treatment there as well. And then finally, our most restrictive environment would be a homebound or hospital program. And typically, students who are within homebound or hospital programs are students who are medically fragile. So students who have muscular dystrophy and or have lost a lot of their strength might be on homebound, where a teacher actually comes to their house and delivers instruction, or they're provided with services and instruction within the hospital. So lastly, I want to talk to you a little bit about inclusive education. So this concept is heard a lot within schools, and inclusive education is simply the concept that all students with disabilities should or can be served within the general classroom setting. There's very differing opinions on this concept, and I won't necessarily share mine with you. I just want to expose you to this idea. There's arguments for and against it. Main arguments of full inclusion, people who advocate for this are things such as students are exposed to the education that they deserve, typically for their age range, and students are not kept away from their same age peers. Both very important concepts. And then people who argue against it is that a big argument is that classrooms and teachers and parents and students are all not prepared for it. You have to consider things like how a student who has a significant disability is going to react, and how students who are typically developing are going to react. So I encourage you to explore that concept more. It's definitely a hot topic within our educational system today. So that's it for today. I hope you guys have a great week, and I'll see you later.